Hello and welcome to Critical Readings, episode 325 for the 1st of June, 2026. I'm Dr. Sean Philip Cooper, and with me today I have Drew Keene
Salutations.
and Lane Haygood.
Hello.
Good afternoon, Lane. Hello to you
Good
listeners.
afternoon.
If you're watching us live on Discord, which you can do, then hello, you've been watching us set this up. And if you're joining us for the first time on video, we have to apologize for the amateurish way this is being done. I just got it all set up this morning, and I'll have our scene transitions and stuff done for the third episode in this sequence, which will be episode 327. But I think that you'll find that we are doing our best with the technology we have, and we're back and ready to do our summer session of T.H. White's The Once and Future King, which I have here in a rather old and battered, I think it's Putnam? Yeah, Putnam hardcover, which is still in print, actually. You can get it on Amazon for $20 brand new. Not a bad edition to have. Over the next 14 weeks, we'll be reading all 4 books in The Once and Future King, because it's a sort of a collection of books. There was actually a 5th book called The Book of Merlin that was incomplete at the time of White's death, but it was published separately as a standalone volume. You can buy it and read it. It includes some content that was in The Once and Future King, because as I said, it was incomplete, so there was stuff that was duplicated and stuff that was reworked. But it's worth reading, I think, but not really necessary if you want to get the whole story. It's all really self-contained. Today we're going to be reading chapters 1 through 8. And next week we'll be reading chapters 1 through 7 this week, and 8 through 13 next week. Our reading schedule is posted on this episode. It's also posted on our Ralph Waldo Emerson episode as well, and you can look it up there. Well, without further ado, we should discuss a few things about The Once and Future King's background and its author, Terence Hanbury White, who was a sort of medievalist, an expert in literature, one of the sort of jack-of-all-trades kind of literary critics that existed at the beginning of the 20th century when literary criticism was just finding its form. Also, the heyday of Freudianism. And Drew, do you have anything you'd like to add about what a Freudian reading of literary criticism might look like?
Well, I mean, Freud is the first writer that gave us an account of human psychology driven by the unconscious drives that sort of haunt us. So his vision of um, the human soul is a tripartite one, somewhat similar to Plato's, but it consists of the id at the bottom, which is just German for it, and then the ego, which is just Latin for I, the conscious self, the one that does the talking, the discursive person, and then the superego, or the uber I, the ideal vision of the self, what you think you ought to be, and the id, the it, which is this unconscious underneath, is what drives behavior, and the superego is sort of um, like a backseat driver, really, just constantly wagging its finger, saying, "Oh, you ought not to have done that. You really ought to do this." Making you feel guilty and self-conscious about everything. And the discursive self, you, the I, the speaker, you're sort of caught between them. So that's sort of a basic overview of what a Freudian picture of the human would be. And then when you apply that to literature, then you're looking for the ways in which these unconscious drives sort of manifest in the behavior of characters.
Thank you. That's excellent. And I think as we get further and further into The Once and Future King, this becomes more and more pronounced, particularly in the last 2 volumes where the Freudianism becomes almost explicit. Freud is never named, but we get. Actually, I think maybe Freud is named. Now that I say that, it's possible that his name is dropped. But in the beginning, of course, the very first volume that we're going to be looking at over the next, I think, 3 or 4 weeks, The Sword and the Stone, it tends to be more of like a young adult story, right? It's about being turned into animals. It's about a very young King Arthur who is nicknamed the Wart. And in fact, in this sequence, White only kind of borrows from Mallory. In fact, he called The Sword and the Stone, quote, a preface to Mallory, end quote. So that is to say, not including things in Mallory, sort of a prequel, if you will, to what Mallory would go on to write in Le Morte d'Arthur, because as we found in our summer series on Le Morte d'Arthur a few years ago, it gives us Arthur's conception, but then it takes him out of the story. We know that he's with Ector, but Mallory doesn't write anything about what happens until the moment when Kay goes off to his tournament in, I think it's in London or Winchester, and they encounter that sword in the stone. But for all those years in between, we don't know what becomes of Arthur. So
It's a bit like the first century gospels, two of which give us an infancy narrative for Christ, but then they skip ahead to now he's a full grown man. And in the second century, there were a lot of gospels written, sort of fanciful portrayals of, well, what was his childhood like? And so there's some really fun stuff. But that's sort of what this is. It's filling in the gap in our source material.
And now we have The Chosen, right? On
Yeah,
Netflix
yes.
and stuff. You can watch your discarded sort of heterodox gospels on television. Well, briefly, I have here on my phone a little list of details about White that I think it says here they began reading in the autumn of 1937. He began reading, or probably rereading in his case, Mallory. He didn't have anything else to do, couldn't find anything that would inspire him. He had written some other books by then, but he picked up Mallory and began reading it, and he said, quote, I got desperate among my books and picked Mallory up in lack of anything else. Then I was thrilled and astonished to find that A, the thing was a perfect tragedy with a beginning, a middle, and an end implicit in the beginning, and B, the characters were real people with recognizable reactions which could be forecast. Anyhow, I somehow started writing a book. The novel, which White described as a preface to Mallory, was titled The Sword and the Stone. It was published in 1938, and it was, of course, as we will discover, followed by 3 other books. Now, before we get to those, we do have some comments from last week, and I also have these, so I'll pull them up right now, and they are also on my mobile device. We have one from Shy, and it's an Arthurian one, so I think we should read it first. And here's what it says. You have to forgive me as I take off my glasses. Dear Critical Readings panel, looking forward to starting the summer series. Somewhat auspiciously, I recently came across a pop-up outside my office in New York City where they were giving away books. I picked up Ivor Winner's Edward Arlington Robertson, not having heard of Robinson before, and having only somewhat remembered hearing of Winters. It piqued my curiosity. I learned that Robinson actually wrote several long Arthurian poems. To my delight, I wanted to know if the panel has read Robinson's Arthuriana, and if it's recommended. Are there other important Arthurians in English that haven't been discussed on the podcast yet? As an aside, I'll be curious to hear the panel's thoughts on the criticism of Ivor Winters, as I'm encountering it for the first time and I'm not sure what to think. He seems a bit opinionated and quick to say a poem is bad, even coming out pretty harshly against Tennyson's idols in several passages in this book. Thank you. Well, that was Eliot, who is the reason for that. It was Eliot who first inveighed against Tennyson's idols. Incorrectly. In fact, this was in the discourse this week. I don't know if you saw this, Drew, but Amit Mamujar published an article or an essay, I should say, in The Lamp, I think. Or no, maybe it was First Things. I stand corrected, First Things, where he in a very offhanded way dismissed the idols as boring, overwrought, padded out, etc. And these were Eliot's criticisms, and they're false, right, listeners? We've read them both.
It's what you would expect a modernist sensibility to say about a Victorian poem. I mean, none of that's unpredictable.
It's not unpredictable, but it's also unfair.
Sure, yeah, but Eliot was never one to let fairness get in the way of his views.
It's been in
And
the discourse a lot because uh, President Nixon, his reading list has been in the news lately. It's a pretty good one, incidentally. Some young student in politics wrote him and said, "What should I read?" And he gave him a list of histories and biographies that are really top notch. Like you couldn't do wrong reading any of them, and all of them would be a really good lesson in history. But it turned out that Russell Kirk met Nixon, and Nixon, an avid reader, said to Russell Kirk, "What one book should I read?" And James Matthew Wilson said Kirk really missed an opportunity because he told him to read Eliot's Notes Toward a Modern Culture, or Notes Toward a Definition of Culture, excuse me, which is not a good choice, actually, in the view of James Matthew Wilson. He called it a missed opportunity. And it turns out, I think Nixon never read it. He ended up not reading that. So probably not the best thing he could have suggested. But Eliot was, very unfair to Tennyson. And Emmett has picked up on that and is basically just kind of parodying it. And I think that's a sort of, one doesn't wish to accuse a famous poet or critic of being ill-read. But if you have read Tennyson's Idylls of the King and you have read Le Morte d'Arthur, I don't know how you could possibly come to the conclusion that the Idylls is padded out. It's a good deal shorter, much shorter than Mallory. So in what way is it padded out? Because
Well, you would say it's padded out if you started with Eliot's modernist conception of what poetry ought to be and do, which is a very kind of, it's like modernist design in buildings and in decor, it's extremely pared down. And so, yes, from that point of view, Tennyson looks like he's got a lot of unnecessary frills and is padding things out. But that wouldn't have been padding from the point of view of a Victorian.
Well, indeed not. And to our view, if you're reading Le Morte d'Arthur and then you read the Idylls, much of what is in the Morte is not in the Idylls, so it looks cut down. If you're a Mallorean like I am, right? Like to me, the Idylls is a very slim version of.
Well, I would think what he means by the padding isn't narrative content, but rather the kind of language that's being used. So the language is wordier. It's more loose than Eliot would like. Eliot wants like razor kind of strictness in economy of words.
Someone should show Eliot those battle sequences. Right.
But there's a reason we can't understand it because, as Eliot himself explained, you have to be a genius poet in order to understand poetry, which is why C.S. Lewis couldn't be a literary critic.
It's that Emersonian line, right?
Yes.
Eliot, secret transcendentalist. Who knew? Well, thank you for that, Shai. Now, Shai also asked about E.A. Robinson, and I thought we did. Did we not do an episode on E.A. Robinson?
I think we've talked about it. I don't know that we've done it yet.
Well, if we didn't, that's on us, and we apologize because we should do an episode on E.A. Robinson. Yes, in fact, there is a series of books published by Boydell and Brewer, or D.S. Brewer, one or the other. I think it might be both nowadays, called Arthurian Studies. And people who work in Arthuriana, like me, have to buy scores of these ridiculous brown volumes. And in them, there are also a series of Arthurian poets. There's a series of those as well. And that includes stuff like Charles Williams and E.A. Robinson and John Masefield. And so they basically take all the Arthurian work of these poets who are modern, and they bind them up, and then they sell them. So there is a volume on E.A. Robinson, and as I said, on Charles Williams. And we've done some others as well, right? There are actually lots of modern pieces of Arthuriana, particularly anything after the graveyard poets, right? Thomas Gray and Thomas Warton and stuff like that. You get a lot of Arthuriana. Not all of it as well remembered because of Tennyson, really, and also because of White, who are kind of like the titans of modern Arthuriana. And they're so powerful and so influential and so well written, contra Eliot, that they kind of blot the rest out. It's hard to. It's like Tolkien, right? Everybody knows who Tolkien is. But once you go down from Tolkien to the other fantasy authors of the 20th century, they have less name recognition because Tolkien is so enormous and so powerful that it kind of, everyone reads that and then they don't read anything else. But
Well, and
the
it's
answer is
also
yes.
it's the same sort of trouble that you get, post Alexander Pope. There's like a century of poets trying to do everything Pope did, and they're just sort of derivative. They're like off-brand Pope, and that's what you get with a lot of the fantasy
Chaucer. The
stuff.
same thing happened after Chaucer,
The
right?
same thing happened after Chaucer, yes. And with Tolkien, you get so many fantasy writers who want to recreate on their own an experience like they had when they first read Tolkien, that a lot of their work just feels very derivative, like it's just sort of second-rate Tolkien.
Wheel of Time, Robert Jordan, right? That's whenever I think of derivative Tolkien. Sorry to those who love Robert Jordan and his sainted memory, but it's just 14 volumes in which nothing much happens, and then it ends. Not mercifully
Well,
at that point.
you can't have too much happen in each book, otherwise then you can't sell another book.
It's torturous. I couldn't get. I had my wife bought me the whole set, all 14 volumes, including the Brandon Sanderson ones at the end, and I got through part of the first book. And I don't want to throw books, but I was ready to like chuck it. I'm like, this nothing is happening. All these people about whom I care nothing, and they're doing nothing for pages and pages of nothing. And then you pick up Lloyd Alexander, written for young adults, a little slim volume, and you read the Book of Three, and it's fantastic. It's moving. The people are doing interesting things. They're saying interesting things. Something is always happening. And then it's over and you really want to read the next book. And I think maybe if Jordan had taken that approach, made little slim books, then it would have been good. I'm not against long books. We read them. We're reading one now. But there has to be enough there to justify a big, thick book like this.
Well, I think one of the
padding, that's a good example.
Yeah, that's the padding.
Yes.
Where's Elliot when we need him?
I think that T.H. White is a really good example of how to avoid doing the derivative thing, because he was obviously very impressed with Mallory. He also wrote a thesis on Mallory. So there's a kind of real interest and a desire to recreate something Mallory like. And yet, The Once and Future King is most certainly not an imitation of Mallory or derivative in that way. I mean, it's really quite fresh, so he's a really good example of how you can avoid that sort of pitfall of imitating rather than being inspired by.
No, I think that's absolutely correct, Drew. And in fact, listeners, while I was away at the International Medieval Congress, I met with my mentor and thesis director, Kevin Grimm, recently retired from Oakland University here in Michigan. And he's a Mallorean as well. And we had a long, long, long talk about Mallory over lunch one day. And I asked him to be on the podcast. I said, would you like to come be on a podcast about T.H. White's The Once and Future King? And he said, well, let me think about it, because he hasn't read it in 40 years. And eventually he wrote back and he said, well, I haven't read it in so long. I don't know that I'd have anything to add. I can't really remember it. And he's in the middle of working on a book on Mallory. He said, I don't want to get all confused, basically. So like, okay, fair enough. That's right. I'm rereading it now for the first time in about 15 or 20 years myself to kind of refresh my memory. And one of the things that came up in our discussion, he asked me about T.H. White. And I said, well, the problem that I have with White is that I read Mallory first. I thought it was a pretty fine book, but nothing life-changing, nothing I wanted to spend the rest of my life working on. And then later, I think when I was a teenager, I read The Once and Future King because I had missed it when I was a child, and a friend recommended it to me. And I said, wow, what a fantastic book. I'm going to go back and read Mallory and find all of this stuff. And I went back and read Mallory, and you can't find all this stuff because it's not there. Right? It's White's invention. But I told my directed this. I said, you may remember when I was studying under you that I would often get Mallory and White confused because they kind of blend together in my mind. And I said, but what I discovered is that although a lot of what is in White is not in Mallory, it does have a sort of genesis in Mallory. Like there's a fundamental like thing that pricks Mallory and says, oh, there's a sort of an inception point, and you can trace back to that. You can see why his Lancelot is an ill-made knight, why his Lancelot looks at himself and sees an ugly, deformed knight, and the rest of the world sees the best knight in the world, right?
Yeah.
There's a point in Mallory where you can you can look at the healing of Sir Uri, for example, when, Lancelot heals Sir Uri, proving he's the best knight in the world, even though he knows that he's an adulterer and a sinner. And, there's both the guilt of it and also the terrible recognition that he knows how wicked he is, and yet somehow he's still the best knight in the world, right? That's a terrible, right? And so Lancelot weeps in Mallory, and you can see, like, this is the idea that gives White, oh, no wonder Lancelot looks at himself and sees himself an ugly man, because he knows the truth of what he is. He knows the depth of his own depravity. But in any case, we're getting rather off the beaten path here. We have one more question.
I would just want to add one other thing, which is to say that Tennyson is another example of the same kind of thing. Tennyson is clearly inspired by Mallory, but The Once and Future King is a unique and fresh work. It's not simply an attempt to recreate Mallory.
Well, think about the Tristram sequence in the Idylls, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think that shows Tennyson at his best in some ways, as does the Passing of Arthur. But the Tristram sequence has that dramatic conclusion, right? Mark's way and cleaves Tristram to the brain with his sword right from behind. There's a dramatic power there that is all Tennyson's own in the way that scene is carried off. Anyway, to Susan's comment, and this is from a week earlier, and this is about Midsummer Night's Dream. She writes, according to AI,
that's a bad beginning to start.
Not the auspicious beginning we had in mind, Susan. According to AI, a comedy was defined in Shakespeare's time as a play having a happy ending. But please let me know if this definition is wrong. It's rather simplistic. I wouldn't say it's wrong as such, but it could be wrong.
It is a necessary part of Shakespeare's definition of comedy. I wouldn't say it's sufficient to explain his comedy, but yes, if a play has a happy ending for its protagonists, then it's a comedy.
Does it end in a wedding? Okay, it's a comedy.
It doesn't mean, incidentally, that there can't be bad things that happen to lots of people in there. Right. But the protagonist has to have a happy ending.
That's it, exactly. Yes. And then she goes on to say, my question is whether Shakespeare intended A Midsummer Night's Dream to have a happy ending in a sincere way or in an ironic way. The way I see it, 3 of the 4 couples have very dysfunctional relationships, which will probably end in unhappiness and possible disaster. Well, that's very negative, Susan. I think they probably work out all right. Anyway, Oberon has played a really nasty trick on Titania in order to steal her Indian boy. She seems confused after the spell is lifted during the play, but it is likely that when she realizes what he has done, she will be outraged. Hippolyta is a prisoner of war and appears to be making the best of a bad situation. She only gets 13 lines in the play, and in most cases, Theseus is contradicting whatever she says. This hardly seems like a happy marriage. Demetrius is a horrible person who tried to force a woman to marry him who would rather die. Even if the spell making him love Helena is permanent, he is someone who will choose to treat other people badly, and he will be a poor husband. Lysander and Hermia are the only ones who may truly be in love. However, their ability to wed required Demetrius to be put under a spell, and Theseus to overrule the law of Athens. Without magic and the law on their side, they might have ended up like Pyramus and Thisbe, or Romeo and Juliet. Am I misinterpreting Shakespeare's intent due to my modern perspective? Or do you think Shakespeare intended us to believe that Titania, Hippolyta, and Helena would just grin and bear it and be happy, obedient wives, and thus This is actually a happy ending to the play.
Look, Shakespeare is always operating on more than one level at once, and he expects there to be people in his audience who will take the play at surface level and see it happily reinforcing hierarchy and status quo, and not really anything deeper. And most of his plays on the surface level seem as if they are serving to reinforce the status quo of Shakespeare's day. And yet they contain all of these elements of subversion and ambiguity that at a deeper level, for an audience that's paying closer attention, I think that undermines the surface level meaning.
No, I think that's right. Shakespeare is not just simple literal. You read it, you understand it, and you're done. Shakespeare is like a tiramisu, right? There's all sorts of different levels of meaning, metaphorical meanings, readings, and counter readings. And really, as long as you can justify reasonably your reading, it's probably, reasonable, decent. Doesn't mean that all readings are equal, but as long as you can support it and justify it, we're willing to entertain it. I think whether or not you want to come away thinking that it's not a comedy, I suspect that Shakespeare probably would have understood it as a comedy, but that doesn't mean that it's free of any sort of countervailing narrative that runs underneath, or push that maybe he wants you to think about the society in which the characters are living, and of course the society in which the audience is living, as we talked about during the play. There's a lot of stuff there that is relevant to the Elizabethan political sediment.
The classification, comedy or tragedy, pertains to the surface level narrative.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly. So, Romeo and Juliet is a tragedy because its surface level narrative is one that ends badly for the protagonist. But there's all sorts of things in the play that poke so much fun at and undermine this sincerity of what's happening for these teenagers, that you might think, oh, well, maybe it's not a real tragedy. It's almost a mock tragedy. But it doesn't matter for the purposes of classification. Comedy and tragedy just depend on the surface level.
That's it, exactly.
Aristotle's definition of comedy was that it has to portray or imitate men worse than the average, whereas tragedy is imitating men better than the average. So it's kind of like if you can look at the tragic hero and be like, well, there's something aspirational, versus the comic subject, and you're like, I can laugh at this because this person is less than me. That was Aristotle's register. And so I think in that way, you have to say, yes, we look at the characters in A Midsummer Night's Dream, and we're okay laughing at them because we see their foils and foibles. No one is that sort of noble, tragic hero there.
And that's why the play could not be about Theseus and Hippolyta, because they're only the appropriate subject matter for tragedy in the Aristotelian understanding of drama that Shakespeare has.
Well, thank you for your comments, and if you'd like to post more on episodes 1 and 2 of this Sword in the Stone sequence, we will read your questions in the third episode, which will be episode 327, because we record these bi-weekly. And you can also watch these recordings and listen to them live on our Discord chat, which is open to our supporters. And if you would like to join us, then you can check your email. Now, we've already sent out links to all of our current supporters, but if you missed it, then you can reply to the email that you received, and we'll send you a new invite link, and you can join our Discord chat, where several of our subscribers are already that. We've got forums there for discussions about topics of interest, and as I said, you can watch the podcast being recorded live. You can also listen to the podcast the moment it's uploaded to the site without having to wait for Monday at noon when it gets sent out on all the distribution channels. We put the links up as soon as they're edited. So there are lots of features on Discord for our subscribers. So check that out if you are one, and send us an email if you would like your link at critreadings@icloud.com. All right, well, that's it for our preliminary stuff. Let's get to The Once and Future King by T.H. White. This first week, we read the first 7 chapters of The Sword in the Stone, and it begins with rather an interesting thing. It's a sort of catalog of what Arthur does for schooling, right? And the type of schooling they receive is not really. I mean, it depends on when you set the story, right? T.H. White is very evasive. When does this take place, right? Does it take place in Mallory's 15th century? Does it take place in the high Middle Ages of the 10th and 11th centuries? Well, he seems to imply the answer to both those questions is no. He follows Mallory, and Mallory imagines, from what we get in Le Morte d'Arthur, that this is taking place in roughly the 9th century, 8th, 9th century, which is when Geoffrey of Monmouth and Gildas and Nennius all thought that the historical Arthur lived, that he was a king during probably the 8th or 9th centuries in what we would call the Dark Ages, right? That period between the rise of the High Middle Ages, but after the fall of Rome. This is a period in reality there was a famous English king, but it was Alfred the Great, not Arthur. And he too was coming in a long line of Romans, right? In fact, Alfred had been to Rome. He had met the Pope. And that is what supposedly happens to Arthur, right? Arthur goes, as we know, to Rome, and he makes Lucius submit to him. So there's a sort of sense in which these kind of Arthur-Alfred narratives overlap in a very general sense. But
He does seem to imagine Arthur as a Saxon, because in the one of the chapters that we've read, there's an interlude in which they actually mention being Saxons. So he doesn't seem to imagine a Celtic Arthur.
No, and see the Celtic Arthur would be the Britannic Arthur, right?
Yes, yes.
So this is quite interesting that there's this sort of fuzziness, and White is doing it deliberately, as we'll see later on. He doesn't want to nail down even Mallory, gets us to roughly the 8th or 9th century, but T.H. White does not want us to do that. And yet, all of the accoutrements of his knights, these are not 8th or 9th century accoutrements. These are the chevalier culture of the post-11th century, right?
Right.
So what's going on here? Well, it's what Mallory was doing, right? Mallory takes his Arthur, and he puts him in what is basically, for Mallory, recent history, right? The 13th and 14th centuries. Mallory's writing in the mid-15th century. So he's imagining an 8th century Arthur with 15th century mores. And remember, that's what Shakespeare does, right? We just did this with Midsummer Night's Dream. We're looking at ancient Athens, but everyone is an Elizabethan, right?
It's a characteristic of all sort of medieval to early modern artistic depictions of the past. The past gets depicted as if it was essentially indistinguishable from the present, including in costuming and architecture and all these surface level details.
Absolutely.
And White is doing it, but doing it self-consciously in a way that's really quite amusing. So we get a kind of early 20th century re-envisioning of Mallory's re-envisioning of the early Middle Ages, which is really layered and fascinating. And we also get it because we have a narrator who is clearly from the 1930s.
Yeah, it's White.
The narrator talks about things you couldn't possibly know the 15th century or the 9th century. Only you would know from the 20th century.
Indeed. And he has White's fascinations. He has White's views. This will be very important when the narrator goes kind of off-piste and starts making kind of philosophical observations, which he does with greater and greater frequency as we go through the work, right? Until we conclude, and he's, he'll venture into little essays. So the narrator is really White, kind of, one step removed. We don't see his face, but he's got his views and he's going to tell us them. And his characters also represent his views to a degree as well. White was a noted pacifist. And we'll see in White's Merlin some of those views coming out.
Mm-hmm.
So I think you've put it admirably well, right? That there's this way in which the past is presented as the present. This is especially, I think, moment because there's a lot of discourse around the Christopher Nolan Odyssey that's coming out,
Yes.
right? Particularly around its dialogue and its casting choices and things. Not even out yet, I don't think, right?
No,
It comes out in the middle of the summer, and I had done on my blog a very long essay about how every staging of the Odyssey or representation of it gets updated for its modern cultural milieu. I mean, that is essentially the most authentic thing you could do to Homer is updated according to the prejudices of the day.
I think that
well, Homer himself is an amalgam of different time periods. I mean, some
Right.
parts of the Iliad are clearly Bronze Age, and some parts of it are clearly Iron Age. I mean, sometimes they're working with bronze swords, and sometimes they have steel. So it's already an amalgamation.
Well, the idea of Homer as a single person, I think,
There is no such person.
yes, exactly. It's just layers of additions of
But don't tell
additions of
don't tell
amendments.
Cooper. He doesn't like that.
there's only one Homer. He's barefoot and blind, wandering around, reciting his poems like a troubadour. Well, in any case, this is exactly what happens, right? With Arthuriana, it gets updated. It's what Shakespeare was doing. So it's interesting that it's only when we get to the 19th century, and this is actually it's not even only the 19th century because it's the thing that's inveighed against Mallory in the 16th century, right? Is that it's not historically accurate. These aren't real. It's not true. It's ridiculous to believe that an 8th century king had 15th century weapon. People were beginning to realize this in the 16th century, and they dismissed all of Arthuriana, with one wave of their hands on this ground that it wasn't historically grounded. And when we get to the 19th century, during the Victorian medieval revival, when medievalism is becoming a thing, medievalism is like a sort of performative or kind of caricature version of medieval life. Sort of thing you see at a Renaissance fairs, right? That's medievalism.
Yeah.
There's this idea, again, that starts to build in the scholarly community that's in opposition to this that says these things aren't historically grounded. And then we get to the 20th century and people are saying, well, this isn't how people at that time spoke. This isn't how people at that time acted. It's not how people at that time dressed. And therefore, this work should be dismissed. And I would say, well, if you look at that may be what we think today in the 20th and 21st centuries, but that is an unusual, compared to the hundreds of years previous, that is an unusual way to look at literature, where for hundreds of years, for millennia, in fact, we were perfectly fine with that. That was normal. That was an accepted practice. So why is it suddenly unacceptable? Are we so enlightened that we can't watch A Midsummer Night's Dream because everyone's wearing Elizabethan garb? Surely not. So let's be a little more tolerant.
It's a kind of refusal to separate out different enterprises. History is a different thing than narrative. The historian is trying to reconstruct as accurately as possible what the past was like, which is always a provisional enterprise, which means more research leads to new reconstructed versions of the past. I mean, it's constantly changing as we learn more things. Whereas a narrative representation of the past is up to something else. Historical accuracy is usually not the point. And even if it is something the author cares about, it's usually not their main point. Otherwise, it would be a documentary, not a narrative.
That's it exactly. A sort of discussion on this came up in our forums on Discord, where someone asked about using translations, right? Have you really read a book if you've read a translation? Or do you have to read it in the original? And if you go to someone like Cleanth Brooks, who says, well, it's a heresy of paraphrase, right? If you read something that's been paraphrased or translated, you haven't read it. You've read the translation or the paraphrase. We have to understand that there's a difference between a scholarly approach, what a scholar needs, and what a scholar is trying to do when a scholar is reading a text in order to make an argument, where accuracy is of the utmost importance. And so you really do have to go to the source because you can't risk the danger of paraphrase, as opposed to what an ordinary reader is trying to accomplish when they sit down to read the Odyssey, right? Or when they sit down to read, I don't know, Dostoevsky. Do you really need to read it in Russian if you're just trying to experience the story, the characters, and the plot? Well, no, not really, right?
Well,
Especially as
and
a
let's just
translation.
press that even a little further, because let's say that you have studied Russian enough to be able to read a novel in Russian. That does not therefore mean that you will derive the same benefits as someone who grew up reading Russian literature, because you still won't catch all of the allusions. You still won't
Exactly.
catch all of the subtlety. You know, you've only got enough Russian to be able to read a novel. That's totally different than being immersed in the language.
Think how many
So, you know,
English readers can't get the illusions in English books, right? So imagine how bad the situation will be if you're a beginner in Russian. All these things are going to go completely by the board.
But for the
indeed.
people who are so hyper concerned about that level of accuracy outside of the scholarly context, they're also the type of really unimaginative people who don't believe in the deeper layers of meaning or understanding there. For them, everything is either on the surface or it's just invented poppycock.
Indeed, right? That's a very strange attitude to take, because it's at once hyper scholarly in its focus on accuracy and completely unscholarly in refusing to accept any depth to a work at all, kind of reducing it to a surface level meaning. So we'd like to
It's
encourage you.
pedantry. It's pure pedantry.
Pedantry, yes, that's it exactly, right?
And
It's
a hatred of nuance is how I've taken to framing it. It's people who want the world to fit within their cozy little boxes and are unwilling to accept that everything is fuzzy and you just have to embrace it and run with it and enjoy the fuzziness, enjoy the ambiguity, enjoy the nuance.
that's what makes great
Indeed.
literature great. It's multifaceted.
And you can, at one and the same time, admit that yes, every adaptation of Homer is just that. It's an adaptation. It's got to try to do something fresh and new within its own context, and still dislike Nolan's adaptation. Just because you agree in principle that that's what you have to do doesn't mean that you like every adaptation that exists.
Exactly,
Hey,
as we discussed
doesn't
with
mean he's going to
Midsummer
do it
Night's
well.
Dream. You can love the play
Exactly.
and like or dislike different imagined versions of the play. I don't like
Just like
people
you
being
couldn't
green.
stand the green fairies.
Why is everyone green? They
Now that I'm
came
thinking
from
about that,
Mars. It's
is that an
bizarre.
absinthe reference? Are they making a
It's all been,
neo-gothic
yeah. The
reference
idea is to
there?
sell more absinthe. That's the idea. All right. Well, now we really do have to get to the Once and Future King. We've used up all of our podcasting time talking about green people. Okay, so again, the beginning of the novel, it begins with this kind of fictive, imagined version of Arthur's schooling, right? And his original teacher, sort of governess lady, who it turns out, White tells us, she had spent a good deal of time in a mental asylum. Right, and that's a very late 19th, early 20th century notion as well. There aren't, madhouses in 8th century Britain.
Right.
That's a ludicrous proposition. So what is White doing? Well, as Drew said, White is setting up a sort of 20th century version of 15th century Mallory's imagined version of 8th century Britain. Or
Exactly.
to put that another way, White is engaged in exactly the same kind of task that Mallory is engaged in. He's going to present Arthur as if Arthur lived more or less now. He's not going to dispense with the necessities of Arthurian storytelling. So there's going to be chivalry and knights and things like that, which for Mallory were an anachronism. They didn't exist in the 8th century. They only come around in about the 10th century as chevalier culture morphs into chivalry. It's a process that develops over the 10th and 11th centuries. So hundreds of years after the putative historical Arthur existed, if indeed there was one. And there's a fine book on this, by the way, by, I think, Andrew Robinson, called The Historical Arthur and the Gowan Poet. I reviewed it for the European Conservative a while back. And it's very provocative. And so there's a lot of discourse about it. But whether or not there's a historical Arthur, that's a current text by a scholar that attempts to wrestle with that question. He says there was one. So in any case, even if
But
there were one.
even if there is a historical Arthur, the Arthur of literature is not that person.
No, no. Arthur and with Guinevere and Lancelot and the Holy Grail and stuff. That is purely the creation of the Lancelot Grail and Geoffrey of Monmouth and a variety of other sources, most of which are in the prose Vulgate. It's a long series of Lancelot-focused Arthurian stories about the Fisher King and things like that, right? So the stuff that you see in the films and Arthurian adaptations, they all mostly come from the prose Merlin and the Lancelot Grail cycle. And you can read those too. They're in translation. The Routledge published a big 5-volume edition of the Lancelot Grail that I've got on a shelf. And it's huge, right? It's way longer than Malory. So Malory takes that, and Geoffrey of Monmouth. He also takes some Middle English things called the stanzaic Mort Arthur and the alliterative Mort Arthur, and a few other minor sources, and he kind of collapses them all together, combines some characters, splits others up, and kind of threads the narrative together into what we call Le Mort Arthur. And depending on who you ask, Le Mort Arthur is a collection of works, like separate stories, right? That's what the great Arthurian Vinever argued. Or if you talk to more modern scholars, people like P.J.C. Field, who was Vinever's student and now kind of like the preeminent living Arthurian, it's more of a proto-narrative or even a proto-novel. I go so far as to say it's like an early novel, right? Because I believe it has a narrative arc that goes across.
Well, and it's interesting that White himself thought that it was a kind of proto-novel because he says that it has a clear beginning, middle,
Exactly.
and end, and that the end is implicit in the beginning. So that's the basic characteristics.
That's why I think it's a novel. And my fellow Arthurians disagree with me strongly on this point. But I'm perfectly happy to disagree with them because I'm in good company. I'm in the company of T.H. White. He's one of my favorite authors. So that's not a bad place to be. And if you wanted, I won't get into it now, but if you wanted to ask me what it is that I think White was talking about, it's the thing that I identified back when we did our LMD, which is that it begins in Balin and Balin, right? It's that blood feud that begins with the sword when they accidentally or inadvertently through the curse of the sword begin a blood feud that can be traced all the way through to the very end until it brings down the realm between Arthur and Mordred, right? That there's a blood feud that runs. And it's the inability of people to forgive a blood feud that is actually what destroys the kingdom. And I think that's a very important lesson. And it's something that I believe Malory must have been thinking when he's sitting in prison, that it's the inability to forgive that dooms us, right? It's not actually about politics. It's not actually about piety as such. It's not about adultery. It's not, all of those things happen because of the inability to forgive, this blood feud that's running. And why is Malory in prison? He's in prison for supporting the wrong side in an internecine civil strife between two descendants of William the Conqueror, right? Between the House of York and the House of Lancaster, a blood feud that has at that point been going on for decades. And
well, your reading is not far off from what White does to Malory, and for White, it seems to be very much the struggle against might makes right all through the whole Once and Future King is this struggle against that philosophy.
And it's here in the beginning, right? Just as it is in the end. Mordred is the embodiment of might makes right in the end, right? Up against Arthur, who's trying to channel might for right.
Mm-hmm.
And
you've got to remember when White is writing this in the interwar period, mm-hmm. and how much of the inevitability of the Second World War is through Europe's inability to stop punishing the Germans even decades after the end of the First World War.
How do we learn to forgive, right? And
even it was also probably be informing his analysis of the Great War, because the Great War didn't have a clear moral agenda. It wasn't defensive, it wasn't protective, it was inter-imperial war. And so I think he would probably have seen that Great War as an expression of the mighty throwing around their might.
We're going to fight because we all made promises to fight each other 100
Right.
years ago.
Well, that's it. Exactly right. And when I did my dissertation on Mallory and Tennyson, I said, well, it's these obligations to family, to king, to country, to courtly lovers, to the idea of chivalry. All these competing obligations are what eventually bring down the realm. And I said, I don't know if Mallory recognizes this. Mallory seems to be wedded to the idea that chivalry is a workable system, and he wants to go back to it. He deplores modern chivalry, which is a sort of courtliness, right? There's a fine book called The Rise of Courtliness, which describes the shift from that chevalier culture, which is military culture, to courtly culture, which is about, social graces and, being in the orbit of the king. And Mallory wants to go back to that old way. He's a soldier himself. But I wonder about that now. I think maybe Mallory was even more sophisticated than I thought when I wrote that. And I think that he's really thinking about the large-scale political situation, and he's thinking about his own part in it, and he's also thinking about the future of his realm, which at the moment when he's writing it, it seems locked in intractable war. Little did he know that in the year that Mort Arthur was published, the Middle Ages would end. 1485 is also the date of the Battle of Bosworth Field, in which Richard III is killed, right? And that's pretty much the end of the Middle Ages in Britain and the beginning of the modern era.
Everyone flipped over their calendars to the next month, and they saw, oh, we're in the Renaissance now.
Exactly. Look at that, the early modern era. Amazing. Well, in any case, so White is concerned about these things. He's concerned also about, as Lane pointed out, the present day politics. He's writing this in 1937, 1938. War is on the horizon. Churchill's been saying it's coming. Everybody knows it's coming. Neville Chamberlain is getting ready to board a plane and go over and wave a letter around saying peace in our time, right? Only to find out that Hitler's going to march into Czechoslovakia anyway. And he'll have been royally had, and he'll stand down as prime minister. And while these events, these momentous events, the beginning of the Second World War and the end of the interwar peace, such as it was, are happening, and the writing is on the wall, White sits down to write a book about the danger of might and how it can make a farce of government and the peace. And how does he do that? He does it with an Arthur whose childlike simplicity needs him to be instructed by Merlin. And that's why we get these fable-esque, parable-esque. I mean, how would you describe them? They're these little episodes where Arthur is turned into an animal or a creature of some sort, and he experiences an aspect of humanity refracted in an extreme way through the animals. The first one, of course, is the fishes. And I'm glad you mentioned might makes right being present at the beginning, Drew, because that's where we first hear those words.
Yes,
it's in
exactly.
the mouth of the king of the moat.
The pike.
The pike, right? Let's actually go to that in the text. Why shouldn't we, right? Because it's such a distillation. It's so hard to do this with my glasses on. What chapter is that, Drew? 45 page is my page. It's chapter 5.
Okay.
So he's been warned to be careful of the pike, which is 4 feet long, living in the moat around the castle, in the castle of Forest Sauvage, which is where he lives with Hector. And it's the first time he's been turned into something. So he's turned into this fish, and he's not very good at it. They call him Mr. P, the pike. And here's the end of that chapter where this speech takes place. This is the end of chapter 5. "There is nothing," said the monarch, "except the power which you pretend to seek, power to grind and power to digest, power to seek and power to find, power to await and power to claim, all power and pitilessness springing from the nape of the neck." And he continues, "Love is a trick played on us by the forces of evolution. Pleasure is the bait laid down by the same. There is only power. Power is of the individual mind, but the mind's power is not enough. Power of the body decides everything, the end. And only might is right. Ah, de Wilsemacht. Right? The will to power. It's power that dominates every other consideration. And if there was a philosophy more deserving of critique today, I don't know it. That seems to be the animating force of so much of our politics, no matter where you live in the globe today. This idea that might, that power alone, is an end unto itself. And notice how he assumes that Arthur is seeking it, right? The power you seek.
Mm-hmm. The escape from the pike also sort of provides a good illustration of the sort of Freudian conception of things. As they're escaping, the pike is driven to try to consume them, and even as it's telling them to get away, it is taking steps in the direction of right. And this is sort of the Freudian thing, and this is White is definitely not a materialist. No, there's no kind of Marxist reading here. This is a Freudian, Nietzschean kind of anticipating Foucault kind of. There's a drive that's in the person, a psychological drive to dominate, and that's what is the problem. So it's not that the material forces drive human psychology to operate in certain ways because of their external conditions. The problem is in the id. It's in the it deep inside of you that's just driven to consume.
No, I think that's it. That's it exactly. And this is one of the first places in the novel where we see this really explicit critique of a worldview that we would recognize, right? The novel is full of this, actually. But this is a place where it's really, really laid bare. And I think that that's what these Merlin sequences do. They serve kind of like as barnyard fables. Imagine Orwell's Animal Farm, right? It's a sort of extended version of the same idea.
It's as if Merlin is Aesop,
yes,
but
yes.
Instead of simply narrating the fables with animals, he gets to go into the fable with animals.
Yeah, that's it exactly.
He explains exactly why. He tells the wart, education is experience.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So there's a theme going through there that you have to go through this to learn it. I can't just tell it to you, because then you don't have that sort of visceral association inside you of what this really means.
The lesson
which also could be a post-war understanding of education too. If you hadn't been through the war, you don't really understand what war is and why it's so horrific.
Well, that's it too. We see that with Arthur, right? Arthur wants to be a knight. He tells us, this is next week's reading, but he gets really cross and sad about the fact that he won't be one. He'll just be Kay's page. He wants to go and fight. He wants to go do battle. And this is after he's had this lesson from the pike about might makes right. And all the while, the pike is saying this and advancing on him and warning him, you should leave, you should go away, you should depart now. I think it's best if you leave before I do something horrible to you. And these warnings, the word that White uses is they're hypnotic. Even though you're being told, I'm going to destroy you, I'm going to kill you, I'm going to crush you, something about the nature of the warnings is that they're hypnotic and they lull you into a sense of security. And you can definitely see why White would be writing this in 1938, right? I mean, Hitler is basically announcing to the world, I'm going to dominate the world, I'm going to crush the world, and what's the result? A sort of hypnotic, he
doesn't really mean that.
Yeah, he doesn't really. It's a metaphor. Exactly, it's a metaphor. He's speaking figuratively, and everybody just remains inert, right? That there's something about the explicit pronouncements of might that is disarming, ultimately. And that's a terrifying, if White is right about this, that's a terrifying prospect. It means that unchecked might's greatest power is complete honesty, to be totally frank about what it intends to do.
How many times do you hear someone say, well, yes, what that person said is awful, but at least they're telling it like it is?
Yeah, right. Well,
they're not dissembling.
But it's awful, though.
They're going to enslave us all, but he's playing us straight.
There is a kind of rationality, though, in simply siding with the strong, because you think, well, at least they'll keep me safe. It's a kind of cowardly response, but you can see where it sort of comes from. And it is a kind of hypnotic thing. You know, they lull you into a false sense of security. I can be part of the consuming force, then I won't get consumed. You know, if you can't beat them, join them kind of psychology.
Despite the fact that's never worked once in the history of despots and tyrants.
Oh, I'm not defending it. I don't think that it's right, but I can see it is.
No, I agree with you. That is absolutely the psychology of someone. You know, I will join the winning side, but it never quite works out for them that way. As soon as everything else is consumed, what is the line from A Man for All Seasons? The devil turns round on you, all else being flat.
Yes.
Right.
Where will you stand then? Where will you stand in the winds that blow?
Exactly.
The
Yeah.
law protects, right? When you cut all the laws down, you know, what then?
No one's left to protect you.
Well, now, by the way, just as, and I don't think that there's much about Neville Chamberlain that deserves defending. But to be fair to him, my understanding is that he knew that Hitler wasn't appeasable, but that he was going to go east first, and by setting up a temporary peace, Chamberlain gave the UK time to prepare to defend itself. So there was an arms buildup in that little interregnum of peace.
And
so he basically sacrificed.
Yeah.
He sacrificed the eastern countries in order to build up Britain's defenses. Now, that's not necessarily a moral calculation, but it does seem to be what he was doing.
Well, and again, Hitler's greatest tactical blunder is, of course, going east and breaking the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. So, probably good ultimate tactics for Chamberlain.
But that was always his stated goal. Was the East for Germany is what the West was for America. It's this uncivilized wild that we need to take over. He couldn't understand why the Western European powers didn't want to join him. Like, he thought that Britain and the U.S. would understand what he was doing.
Bringing civilization to the masses, right?
He thought that they were on his side.
Though.
Maybe they like the civilization they have. That's the problem.
Right.
Well, there's a couple things I'd like to point out before we wrap up, because sadly we are over time. But two things. First is that Arthur, we get the wonderful characters of Grummer Grummersum and Ector and Pellinor. I love these characters. I think they're brilliant. They're a sort of idea about British aristocracy that is still spoofed today, but increasingly distant from reality. I was reading an article about the aristocracy I want to say it was in the Lamp, but it might have been in the Telegraph, about the changing nature of the aristocracy. I mean, they've all got MBAs now, and they run their estates like tourist centers, right? And so they aren't really eccentric, doddering, they're all professional, sleek business people these days, because you have to be, as the hereditary peers are going, right? So,
they have to behave like the bourgeois to survive in the bourgeois world.
Exactly, right? And then, 50 years ago, that would have been considered really terribly middle class and not the done thing, right? The idea of turning the house into a money-making thing would be unspeakable. It's better that it loses £100,000 a year, and it's, impossible to keep up. That at least is respectable. It's unsustainable, but it's respectable. And now, of course, money-making culture and professionalism has crept in. But when you look at them, there was a great series, I can't remember what it was from, where there's like a sketch show where the line is 40 45 years, and they just keep saying it. How long ago was it? Oh, 40 45 years. 40 45 years. 40 45 years. 40 years? Yeah, 40 45 years. And they just say it over and over and over again, right? And it keeps coming up. And that's what Grummer, Grummersome, and Ector and Pellinor are. They're that idea of sort of gruff, doddering Englishness. And I think it's lovely and wonderful. And we get to see
And Pellinor is that in its imperial expression.
Yes.
You
British
know,
India,
it's
right?
yeah, right. It's the aristocracy of the Victorian era in their old age, pretending like they're real soldiers as they, trample over everyone, basically.
White knew this. He was
And
born
it's
in Bombay, right? He's born in British
right,
India.
exactly. Yes, yes. He knows these people firsthand, and so it really is quite a fantastic satirical portrait of British imperial aristocracy.
And what do they come up with as an idea to get a tutor? You got to have a quest. You got to go a questing to get a tutor. And Arthur ends up completing the quest. He doesn't intend to do it. It just happens. And I think this is interesting because Pellinor, of course, is permanently on a quest. And he's never able to do it. He knows what he's doing, and he can't do it. So there's this interesting dichotomy between Arthur, who completes a quest that he doesn't even know he's on, and Pellinor, who is very much on a quest, is fully aware what it is. He's been on it for decades, and he can't complete it. In fact, he's making no progress whatsoever in, capturing the beast Gladison. It just leads him on, and he carries around its fumits, which he shows
It's
to
the
anyone
it's
he
the
can.
quest. It's the quest of the British Empire. We must keep doing it, but we don't really know what it is.
Quixotic.
What we're doing, what matters. Yes, exactly. There is something very Quixote-esque about Pellinor.
I found Pellinor almost to be a comic reflection of Quixote, intentional on White's part, I'm sure.
No, I think
Yes.
that's it exactly, right? That the idea, certainly by the time White is writing this, the idea of British India has gone. Churchill might still be committed to it, but it's no longer feasible, right? So there's this sense in which the idea of maintaining the empire by the time you get to the mid-20th century just looks like to be increasingly impossible or impractical. So
Have to find covert ways to maintain it. We'll call it a commonwealth.
How's that working out? They keep spinning off into little countries. It's bargain basement imperialism. Well, in any case, so I think that's interesting. And the other thing I wanted to mention is the difference between the similarities between differences between Merlin and Madame Mim. Now, Madame Mim is a complete fabric. Like this comes out of White's head. It's not in Mallory. It's not in any of the sources. There's no Madame Mim. And if you watch,
it's a marvelous invention, though.
If you watch the Disney version of The Sword and the Stone, which I don't necessarily recommend, but
it's a fun movie, though.
Yeah. It's not bad. It's for children. It's great. It's got adventure, and Arthur's American for some reason.
He has
Saturday
to be.
afternoon voice acting, right? It's straight out of the 1980s, it sounds like, although it's from much earlier. But,
done in the 60s, wasn't
it? It is, yeah. So you've got Merlin and Madame Mim. And think about when Arthur runs into Merlin, and we get a description of the place where he lives. There's this ridiculous list of all the things that are there. And I mean, it's enormous. It goes on. It feels like it goes on for an eternity, like a page and a half of, basically a complete inventory of his dwelling. Mustard pots and railway time schedules and the 14th edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica. Right, and a lot of these things have comments that go with them, like the encyclopedia is deprecated because of the sensationalism of its plates, as I recall correctly, right? So this huge list of things, and you wonder, why is White doing this? What's the purpose of this huge inventory of Merlin's dwelling? And of course, these things are taken from all across time, and there are important things there, like really marvelous, magical things. And then there are things that are just bizarre and unusual, and they seem to have no purpose, or they're broken. And everything, absolutely everything, is covered in bird crap because of Archimedes. and he's carrying around half of a pair of pajamas. And he uses that to mop the bird crap off of his hair and face. And that's what he does with this half pair of pajamas. That's his entire function, is to wipe up bird crap. And so you read this and you're like, this is bizarre. It reminds you of Radagast's depiction in the Hobbit films, right? Where he's covered in crap and dirt, and he lives in a hovel that's full of filth, right? I wonder if maybe that's where Jackson got the idea.
Probably so.
Yeah. But Madame Mim gets the same treatment. When we get the description of her dwelling, we also get a large inventory of weird minutiae that, fill her home. And I wonder about this because, she's a White tells us that back then there were only two kinds of wizards, black mages and white mages, basically. And Merlin does white magic, good magic to help people. And Mim doesn't. She does black magic, which is self-serving. It's about power and domination. That's why she wants to eat Wart and Kay.
Mm-hmm.
So I wonder about this. What do we think about this parallel portrayal, even down to they both have extensive descriptions of their possessions, and then they eventually face off in what White tells us is effectively a wizard's game of rock, paper, scissors.
Well, there's a way in which both kinds of magicians have to be detached from ordinary people. So it does sort of show up how odd they are, how different they are. These extensive descriptions of how they live and all these kinds of things. So maybe it's that, they're magical, so they're separated, but they're not separated in the same ways.
I've just been thinking about it all morning. They're very similar, so White treats them similarly, but why the extensive inventory? Maybe this is to show something about the nature of their magic. Because, of course, Merlin in The Once and Future King, or Merlin in Le Morte d'Arthur, he's not doing magic like in Harry Potter, right? This Merlin does kind of get to that. His incantations are in Latin, right? Harry Potter incantations are kind of Latin-esque,
Latin.
right? Latinisms, we might say, like medievalism, right? They're Latinisms. Merlin's are actually in Latin. Largely nonsense or kind of trivial things, but they're extended, Latin-esque things. And I wonder, maybe he's trying to ground this. He wants to give us a modern idea of a wizard, waving a wand and doing spells and turning people into different animals, because he needs that for his story. And indeed, Merlin in Le Morte d'Arthur can change people's appearances, right? He makes Uther look like King, what's his name? Gorlois? I can't remember now. Igraine's wife, right? The Duke of Tintagel.
Right. Yeah.
Igraine's husband, excuse me. So he can change how people look, and he can make himself look different. He can look like a young person, or he look like an old man. So he's a shape changer. And maybe that's why White has his Merlin changing Arthur into different shapes. But there's also something that's not, it's not swords and sorcery, fireballs and lightning and stuff like that. Although he can do that. This Merlin can. The Morte d'Arthur Merlin is kind of grounded in, earth magic, wise man, sort of druidic.
Well, his magic is somewhat odd to me, because you never really get a clear sense of the scope of it, what he can and can't do exactly. Sometimes you think that it doesn't have limitations, and then other times you see that it very clearly does. In fact, when asked to turn Kay into an animal, first he refuses for all sorts of vague reasons, and Arthur keeps pressing the point, and he finally just says, "Look, I can't, because I wasn't sent for him." It was like, what? What do you mean you were sent? Who's authorizing you?
We're going to open with that next week, because I think that's in chapter 8. So yeah, that's vital, that there are limitations and that there's a purpose, right? And so there's a sense in which Arthur is fated to complete this quest, to encounter Merlin, because there is a purpose to their meeting, and there's a purpose that Merlin has to serve with regard to Arthur. There's a destiny at play.
Yeah. One last thing to say about the contrast between Mim and Merlin is in battle, Merlin never does what she thinks he will do. He never goes into a larger form. He doesn't try to one up her. He either goes into a much smaller form so that she's totally thrown off guard and doesn't know how to approach attacking, or goes to an equal form so that there's a kind of standoff. But he's never really trying to win through overwhelming force.
Well, that's it exactly, because as someone obsessed with might and power, her assumption is always going to be that her opponent will likewise go for the most powerful, the strongest, the mightiest thing. And what Merlin does is meekness and smallness and, often, and he wins the battle through that sort of approach.
It's a bit like what, and I wouldn't be surprised if Tolkien was sort of partly inspired by White in this, because this is one of the reasons that Sauron can't conceive of the plan to destroy the ring.
Yeah,
because it's
they
not
use it, right? They would use
right,
the power.
Yeah.
It never occurs to them that they would, discard it or destroy it, put it beyond reach.
Well, and that's the same thing that we saw back with the Pike with Mr. P. Mr. P understands power in one way, and so he assumes, quite naively, that everyone else must assume it in the same way. It's that same thing we were talking about, the lack of imagination in certain types. The types who are obsessed with power, they are unable to imagine that there are people out there who don't want power, who don't see it as a necessary instrument, and they are very often defeated by that. I mean, going back to another literary duel that we talked about in Paradise Regained, that's how Christ defeats Satan. Satan cannot imagine the Prince of Peace aspect of Christ's character.
Right. Yes, exactly.
Well, that's a fine place at which to end this first episode on the Once and Future King. Next week, we will be looking at chapters 8 through 13. Then we'll do 14 through 19, I think. 14 through 19. And then 19 through 24. I've got the numbers mixed up, but we have them on our website. And also, again, if you would like to join us on Discord, you can watch this podcast being recorded live or listen to it being recorded live. Both are options. We have it streaming on our Discord. And you can also get early access to the podcast before it goes live on our website and all of our distribution services, in addition to being able to talk to and have conversations with and do message boards with our other subscribers. So do check us out. You can get access to those features by going to criticalreadings.com and clicking Become a Patron at the top of the page, which helps to support the site and keep all of our podcasts online and ad-free for all of our listeners. We've put your names in the credits. If you're already a supporter, send an email to critreadings@icloud.com. That's it for us. We'll be back next week with the second part of our sequence on The Once and Future King by T.H. White. Until then, from all of us here at Critical Readings, Godspeed.